Well, you've said almost everything I could say about Peter. One of the most remarkable, and in my view, always young. Maybe he wasn't so young as he got older, but he was still young as far as I'm concerned. And he had well, this book shows it. It's beautifully written, and it's very clear that he has learned a lot as he went through the whole process of working with Henry. He's one of the few people I can say worked with Henry. Most of the rest of us worked for Henry. But Peter, I think, was as much the junior partner maybe, but nevertheless a partner with Henry on very many things. And I can't, the interesting part of all of this is I can't remember any particular events. He had a remarkable sense of humor, but the only event I can remember had very little to do with him other than that he and I were with Henry and some others in Paris for negotiating with Lee Ducteau on trying to get the hell out of Vietnam. And all of the Vietnamese were on one side of the table and all of us Americans on the other. Henry was in the center, Peter was at one end, and I was at the other. And then there were some other people in between. And one of them on that side was a fellow named Stearman. And Henry and Lee Ducteau got into an argument over a fact. And that went on for about 5 minutes, with each side arguing about the fact. And finally Stearman said, no, Mr. Secretary, Mr. Lee Ducteau is correct. If you look on page 38 of your briefing book, you will see that his statement is the correct one. There was this dead silence, and I remember looking at Peter, and he was having a terrible time to keep from laughing. And finally, from the depths of his cavernous chest, Stearman, pick up your chair and move it to the other side of the table. And as I say, the only thing I could relate to Peter in that one is that he and I were both horrified, amused, and I figured that Henry was going to end up killing him, Stearman, but he didn't. He was much nicer than I'd expected. Anyway, this book is remarkable, and Peter was remarkable, and he is one of the few people that I know, and you today reinforced it, that I think Henry looked upon close to being a son as anything. And as I think you told me, every day in the hospital, Henry called him. Well, now, you don't get that out of Henry for most people. And I think that shows how much Henry valued him and valued all of his years working with him. And I will leave it at that for now. You don't want me to say anything about the book, particularly at this stage, do you? Other than say that it's an excellent book. I think he is right. I was trying to, of all of the administrations I've lived through, or at least partly lived through, and Bush 41, I guess that's the right number, is, in my judgment, was, and that's not a partisan comment, but in my judgment, he did as well by performing along the lines of what Peter thought were the sensible ways to proceed if you were president. I think he was far better at it than anybody else that I saw, although Nixon came close. But, and this is not, I'm not saying that this is a comment on his ability as president, but in terms of running the staff as best, the way he did and making the decisions he made, he was clearly above and beyond. And the one thing, again, that I will never forget is during the Kuwait mix-up, when we went in and asked Mr. Saddam Hussein to leave, in the preparation for that, the president was on the telephone day after day, talking to every world leader that made any difference, and a lot of them who didn't. And I found it absolutely amazing what he was able to do in terms of talking other world leaders, the Syrians, others, talking them into coming along with us in this effort to get rid of Saddam's presence in Kuwait. And if there were any number of arguments why it was not sensible for the president to remove Saddam from power at that time, but if none other, it was to have done so at that point would have been to violate all of the agreements that the president had made with, all of the understandings that the president had made with the various people that he talked into coming along with us in removing Saddam from Kuwait. So the arguments that were made later by some of the benighted people who, well, never mind, I won't, other than to say that they're screaming and yelling about how the president should have gone after Saddam at that time, were only made once it was fairly clear that he could have done so. But and if he had done so, it would have been taking the advice of certain people who became vice presidents later on, that I think would have been it would have been very unwise to have tried to do it. But anyway, I'm going to let it go until you ask some meaningful questions, if you're up to it. And after we've had...
I clearly am not. Eric, please.
Well, thank you, Carlos. And let me just say what a privilege and pleasure it is to be on the same stage with Secretary Eagleburger, with whom I had the privilege of working when I was much younger, had a little bit more hair, and was more junior in the Foreign Service.
That's the only thing I've kept is my hair.
Carlos mentioned I've had the privilege of now working with two people, Secretary Eagleburger and my most immediate past boss in government, Bob Gates, who, as career officers in their respective services, uniquely came to command those organizations. And it's always put me in mind a little bit of the comment that Tom Lehrer, the musician, mathematician, and satirist, made about 40 years ago. He said, when Mozart was my age, he said he'd been dead for 2 years. He said, it's people like that who make you realize how little you've accomplished in life. So Larry...
He's the one who wrote a Be Prepared, that's the Boy Scouts marching song.
Right.
I won't go on with it further.
But Secretary Eagleburger was always my beau ideal of a undersecretary, and I'm delighted to be here with him. And I'm very grateful to Carlos and Strobe Talbot and Brookings for hosting this event, because I think Peter's really excellent book has not received as much attention as it ought to have. In part, I think, because I think, this is just my speculation, that the Washington Post book world went out of business. They stopped doing a book review at the Post, and Peter's book suffered from being published the same month as we had the presidential transition going on here in the United States. So I think there's a wonderful opportunity to get to talk a little bit about both the book and about Peter. And let me make a few comments about Peter personally before I talk about the book, because as I read the book, I heard Peter's voice speaking to me, just as when he and I would touch base at the end of a day at the Pentagon, connected by our Tandberg secure video devices, and discuss the events of the day, but also discuss national security decision-making and his aspiration to write this book. And I think Peter was in many ways uniquely qualified to write this kind of book, because like Larry Eagleburger, he'd served at high levels of state defense in the White House, and there are frankly not that many people who've had that range of experience.
When did he start writing? Do you remember?
I think about the spring of 2007, right after he left government. Yeah. But he'd been thinking about it for many years before that. But my first encounter with Peter was actually not in person, it was in print, and I think the episode says a lot about Peter. He had written a scathing review in the American Spectator of William Shawcross's book about Secretary Kissinger. The book was called Sideshow. Peter's review was called Sideswipe. And this led to a rather extraordinary exchange in the pages of The Spectator between Peter and William Shawcross.